The convoy hit the IED 3 miles outside Fallujah on a Tuesday morning in October. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams was thrown 20 feet from the Humvee, his body slamming into a concrete barrier with enough force to crack 2 ribs and leave him unconscious for 6 minutes. When he came to, his first thought wasn't about his injuries. It was about his men. All 4 of them were alive, shaken but breathing, and that was what mattered. Marcus didn't know that the blast had done more than break his ribs. He didn't know that the toxic smoke he'd inhaled, the chemicals released by the burning vehicle, the exposure to depleted uranium and other battlefield contaminants would begin a slow, invisible war inside his body. A war he wouldn't even know he was fighting until 11 months later, when the routine blood work came back with numbers that made the base medical officer go very quiet. Sergeant Williams, Dr. Patterson said, looking at the charts in his hands with the expression of a man delivering a death sentence, "We need to talk." The diagnosis was acute myeloid leukemia, aggressive and advanced. The kind of cancer that moved fast, hit hard, and didn't give you time to prepare. The kind that required immediate treatment, constant monitoring, and medical facilities that simply didn't exist in a war zone. "How long do I have?" Marcus asked, because he'd learned in the Army that sometimes the most important questions were the ones you didn't want to ask. With treatment, we're looking at a fighting chance, Dr. Patterson said carefully. Without it, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Marcus was on a transport plane back to Walter Reed Medical Center within 48 hours. As the landscape of Iraq disappeared beneath the clouds, he pressed his face to the small window and wondered if he'd ever see his men again. He'd spent 13 months with Bravo Company, 13 months watching their backs, keeping them alive, bringing them home. Now he was the one going home, and it felt like abandonment. The phone call to Rebecca was the hardest thing he'd ever done, harder than any firefight, any night patrol, any moment of fear he'd experienced in combat. "Baby," he said when she picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and happy in that way that made his chest tight with homesickness. "I'm coming home." "Marcus? Oh my God, really? When? Is everything okay?" The questions tumbled out of her in a rush of excitement and concern. "There's something wrong," he said, because there was no easy way to say it. "Something with my health. I'm sick, Becca. Really sick." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, he wondered if the connection had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and scared. "How sick?" "Cancer," he said. "Leukemia. I'm flying into Walter Reed tonight. Can you meet me there?" She was waiting for him at the airport. And for a moment, seeing her face in the crowd, Marcus forgot about everything else. Rebecca was exactly as beautiful as he remembered. Long dark hair, green eyes that lit up when she smiled, the kind of face that had kept him sane during the worst nights in Iraq. She ran to him when she saw him, threw her arms around his neck, and held him like she was trying to memorize the feeling. But there was something different about her, something he couldn't quite name. A distance, maybe, or a hesitation. When she looked at him, her eyes didn't quite meet his. When she hugged him, it felt like she was holding back. Marcus told himself it was a shock of the diagnosis. Cancer was a big word, a scary word. It would take time for both of them to adjust. The next 6 months were a blur of hospitals, treatments, and side effects that made combat look like a vacation. Chemotherapy turned Marcus from a 200-pound soldier into a gaunt stranger who barely recognized himself in the mirror. His hair fell out in clumps. His skin took on a grayish pallor. His hands shook from the medications, and some days he was too weak to get out of bed. Rebecca tried to be supportive, but Marcus could see the strain wearing on her. She visited him in the hospital when she could, but her visits became shorter, less frequent. She always had somewhere else to be. Work, her sister's house, a friend's birthday party. She'd sit by his bedside and check her phone while he talked about his treatment, about his fears, about how scared he was that he might not make it through this. "I'm sorry," she'd say when he called her out on it. "I'm just tired. This is hard for me too, you know." And Marcus would apologize, because he understood that watching someone you love fight cancer was its own kind of hell. He understood that she needed space, needed time to process what was happening to them. He understood, and he tried to be patient, even when patience felt like the hardest thing in the world. It was during his fourth round of chemotherapy that Marcus saw Rebecca's phone light up with a text message while she was in the bathroom. He wasn't trying to read her messages. He'd never been that kind of husband. But the name on the screen caught his eye because it wasn't a name he recognized. Dave. The message preview showed just enough to make Marcus's blood run cold. Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you when you're at the... Rebecca came back from the bathroom and quickly grabbed her phone, slipping it into her purse without looking at the screen. Everything okay? Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. Fine, she said, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Just work stuff. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that there was an innocent explanation. Dave could be a coworker. I miss you could be something taken out of context. The message could mean anything. But deep down, in the part of him that had kept him alive through 13 months of combat, Marcus knew the truth. When he was discharged from the hospital for a brief break between treatment cycles, Marcus came home to find their house felt different. Rebecca was different. She was distant, distracted, always checking her phone. She worked late more often than she used to. She went out with friends more frequently. And when they were together, really together, she seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Marcus tried to talk to her about it, tried to bridge the growing distance between them, but every conversation ended the same way, with Rebecca getting defensive, accusing him of being paranoid, telling him that cancer was making him see problems that didn't exist. You're sick, Marcus, she said during one particularly painful argument. You're not thinking clearly. I'm doing my best here, but you're pushing me away with all this suspicion and jealousy. Maybe she was right. Maybe cancer was making him paranoid. Maybe the medications were affecting his judgment. Marcus wanted to believe that, wanted to trust the woman he'd married, the woman he'd thought about every single day in Iraq. But then he found the receipt. It was tucked between the pages of a magazine, probably forgotten. A dinner receipt from Romano's, the Italian place downtown that had been their special restaurant, the place where Marcus had proposed 3 years ago. The receipt was for 2 people, dated the previous Thursday, a Thursday when Rebecca had told Marcus she was working late and couldn't visit him in the hospital. The receipt showed 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and a dessert they'd always shared. At the bottom, scrawled in Rebecca's handwriting, was a note. Happy 6-month anniversary, D. 6 months. They'd been together for 6 months, which meant it had started while Marcus was still in Iraq, still fighting for his country, still thinking about coming home to his wife. Marcus sat in their kitchen, holding the receipt, and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with cancer. When Rebecca came home that evening, Marcus was waiting for her at the kitchen table. The receipt spread out in front of him like evidence in a court-martial. We need to talk, he said. Rebecca saw the receipt and went very still. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she sank in the chair across from him, her face pale but defiant. How long? Marcus asked. Marcus, I can explain. How long, Rebecca? She looked down at her hands. 8 months. 8 months. While he was getting blown up by IEDs, while he was watching his men get wounded, while he was lying in a hospital bed being told he had cancer, his wife had been building a life with another man. Who is he? Marcus asked, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. Does it matter? It matters to me. His name is Dave. Dave Morrison. He works at the bank with me. Marcus nodded slowly. The bank where Rebecca worked as a loan officer, the job she'd taken while he was deployed to keep herself busy, to feel productive while her husband was overseas. Do you love him? The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a battlefield. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer immediately, and that told Marcus everything he needed to know. I didn't plan this, she said finally. I didn't want it to happen. But you were gone for so long, and I was so lonely, and Dave was there, and he was kind to me, and I was getting shot at in Fallujah. That's not fair. Fair. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been you telling me the truth, instead of letting me find out from a restaurant receipt. Fair would have been you ending this marriage before you started another relationship. Fair would have been you not getting cancer and ruining everything. Rebecca shouted, and the word seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised Marcus. The silence that followed was deafening. "So this is my fault," Marcus said quietly. "I got cancer and ruined your affair." "No, that's not what I meant." "Marcus, I'm sorry I didn't—" "Get out." "What?" "Get out my house. Go be with Dave. Go live your life. But don't sit here and pretend that my cancer is a problem when you've been lying to me for 8 months. Rebecca was crying now, but Marcus felt nothing. The part of him that had loved her, that had trusted her, that had dreamed about coming home to her, was simply gone. Cancer hadn't killed it. Betrayal had. "Marcus, please, we can work through this. I'll end things with Dave. We can go to counseling. We can—" "No," Marcus said. "We can't, because I'm going to die. Rebecca. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but probably within the next year or 2. And I won't spend whatever time I have left pretending that our marriage means something when it clearly doesn't. Don't say that. You're going to beat this. You're going to get better. Even if I do, even if by some miracle I survive this cancer, I could never trust you again. How could I? Every time I leave the house, every time I'm in the hospital, every time life gets difficult, I'll wonder if you're finding comfort with someone else." Rebecca stood up abruptly. "Fine," she said, her sadness transforming into anger. "If that's how you want it, fine. But don't blame me for needing someone who could actually be there for me. Don't blame me for falling in love with someone who didn't disappear for 13 months and come back broken. I came back with cancer, not a personality disorder. I'm still the same man you married." "No, you're not. You're sick, Marcus. You're dying and you're angry and you're taking out on me because I found someone who makes me happy." "Then go be happy," Marcus said, "but do it somewhere else." Rebecca grabbed her purse and headed for the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might turn around, might say something that could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Instead, she said, "I'll come back for my things when you're at your next treatment." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Marcus was alone. The house felt enormous and empty without Rebecca. Marcus had thought he understood loneliness during those long nights in Iraq, but this was different. This was the loneliness of betrayal, of having the one person you trusted most in the world choose someone else when you needed them most. The cancer, meanwhile, showed no mercy for his personal problems. If anything, the stress of the divorce seemed to make it worse. His blood counts dropped. His treatments became more aggressive. He lost more weight, more strength, more the man he used to be. The medical bills began piling up. Rebecca had been the primary breadwinner while he was deployed, and without her income, Marcus struggled to keep up with the cost of treatment. His military insurance covered some of it, but not all, and certainly not the experimental treatments his doctors wanted to try. He applied for additional assistance, filled out forms until his hands cramped, made phone calls to bureaucrats who put him on hold for hours at a time. Some days, dealing with the insurance company fell harder than dealing with the cancer. Marcus had to sell his motorcycle, then his truck, then most of the furniture. He moved from a house he'd shared with Rebecca to a small apartment across town, partly because he couldn't afford a mortgage and partly because every room held memories of a woman who had chosen someone else over her sick husband. It was in this small apartment, during one of the lowest points of his illness, that Marcus discovered he wasn't as alone as he thought. His neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun, knocked on his door one morning with a container of homemade soup. "You look too skinny," she said without preamble, handing him the container. "My grandson had leukemia when he was 12. I know what sick looks like, and you look sick." Marcus tried to protest that he was fine, that he didn't need charity, but Mrs. Chun waved away his objections. "Not charity," she said firmly. "Neighbors helping neighbors. That's how it's supposed to work." The soup was the best thing Marcus had tasted in months. He hadn't realized how little he'd been eating, how the treatments had destroyed his appetite, how depression had made food seem pointless. Mrs. Chen's soup reminded him that he was still alive, still worth nourishing. Over the following weeks, other neighbors began to emerge from what Marcus had assumed was an indifferent apartment complex. Tom Rodriguez from 2B offered to drive Marcus to his treatments when he was too weak to drive himself. Sarah and Mike from across the hall brought him groceries, refusing to let him pay them back. The teenage girl from downstairs, Ashley, started walking his dog when he was too tired to make it around the block. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked Mrs. Chin one afternoon when she brought him another container of soup. "You barely know me." Mrs. Chin sat down in his living room, her hands folded in her lap, and gave him a look that reminded him of his grandmother. "My husband fought in Vietnam," she said. "When he came home, he was different. Angry, sad, sick in ways that didn't show on the outside. People didn't understand then, didn't know how to help. He died alone because everyone was too uncomfortable to get involved." She paused, looking around Marcus's sparse apartment. "I promised myself if I ever met another soldier who needed help, I wouldn't look the other way. That's not charity, young man. That's debt repayment." The community that formed around Marcus was small but fierce. They took turns checking on him, making sure he was eating, driving him to appointments when he was too sick to drive himself. They didn't ask questions about his wife, didn't pry into his personal life. They simply showed up day after day, with practical help and quiet dignity. Marcus began to understand that he had found something he'd never really had before, a family of choice, people who loved him not because they had to, but because they chose to. But even the best support system couldn't stop the progression of his disease. By his second Christmas in the apartment, Marcus was spending more time in the hospital than at home. The treatments that had initially shown promise were no longer working. His doctors began using phrases like palliative care and quality of life, medical euphemisms that Marcus understood perfectly. He was dying. The realization came not as a shock, but as a kind of relief. He'd been fighting for almost 2 years. Fighting the cancer, fighting the insurance company, fighting the loneliness, fighting the anger at Rebecca's betrayal. He was tired in a way that sleep couldn't cure. Marcus began putting his affairs in order, such as they were. He wrote letters to his old unit, to the men he'd served with in Iraq, letting them know he was proud to have fought alongside them. He donated what little he had to veterans' charities. He spent his good days visiting with his neighbors, the people who had become his family when his real family had abandoned him. Mrs. Chung was with him when he received the call from the hospital. "Mr. Williams? This is Dr. Sanders at Georgetown Hospital. I'm calling about Rebecca Williams. She's been in an accident." Marcus felt his chest tighten, not with love, but with the phantom pain of a wound that had never quite healed. Is she alive?" "Yes, but she's in serious condition. She was in a car accident 3 days ago. She's been unconscious, but she's been asking for you. You're still listed as her emergency contact." Mrs. Chin drove him to the hospital, her old Honda struggling with the weight of Marcus's wheelchair and oxygen tank. He'd insisted on going, though he wasn't sure why. Curiosity, maybe, or the need for closure. Rebecca was in the ICU, her face heavily bandaged, machines beeping steadily around her bed. The left side of her face, what Marcus could see of it, was covered in burns from the car fire that had followed the crash. A nurse approached him. "Are you the husband?" "Ex-husband." Marcus corrected automatically. "She's been asking for you," the nurse said gently. "The burns are extensive. The doctors are doing what they can, but—" Marcus understood. Rebecca was experiencing her own version of what he'd been living with for 2 years. The knowledge that your body was failing, that time was running out, that the people you counted on might not be there when you needed them most. He approached her bed slowly, his oxygen tank wheeling behind him. Rebecca's eyes were closed, but she stirred when she heard the sound of his breathing apparatus. "Marcus." Her voice was barely a whisper, distorted by the bandages and the breathing tube. "I'm here." Her eyes opened, and Marcus could see tears forming in the corners. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry." Marcus wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell her that sorry wasn't enough, that she'd abandoned him when he needed her most, that her apology was 2 years too late. But looking at her now, broken and burned and alone, he found that the anger had simply evaporated. "I know," he said. "Dave left me," she whispered. "When I got hurt, when my face—" He said he couldn't handle it. He said I wasn't the same person anymore. Marcus closed his eyes. Of course he had. Dave Morrison, the bank employee who had been there for Rebecca, when her husband was overseas, who had provided comfort when her spouse was fighting cancer, had disappeared the moment she became inconvenient, just like Rebecca had done to Marcus. "I understand now," Rebecca continued, her voice growing weaker. "What I did to you. How it felt. I understand. Rebecca, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that, but I needed you to know that I understand. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I was wrong, and that you deserve better." Marcus reached for her hand, careful not to disturb the 4 lines. Her skin was cool and dry, nothing like the warm hands he remembered from their wedding day. "I forgive you," he said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Rebecca's eyes widened. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it for you," Marcus said gently. "I'm saying it for me. I don't want to carry anger anymore. I'm too tired, and I don't have enough time left." They sat in silence for a while. 2 broken people who had hurt each other, who had failed each other, who were now facing the end of their stories in hospital beds, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady rhythm of machines keeping them alive. "Are you scared?" Rebecca asked. "Every day," Marcus admitted, "but not of dying. I'm scared of dying alone, of not mattering, of being forgotten." "You won't be forgotten. You're a hero, Marcus. You serve your country. You fought." "I'm not a hero," Marcus said. "I'm just a guy who got sick and tried to handle it with dignity. That's all any of us can do." Rebecca squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "I loved you," she said. "I know I didn't show it. I know I failed you. But I did love you. I still do." "I loved you, too," Marcus said. "I wish it had been enough." The nurse approached them gently. "Visiting hours are ending soon," she said. Marcus nodded and started to stand, but Rebecca held on to his hand. "Will you stay?" she asked. "Just for a little while longer?" Marcus looked at the woman who had been his wife, who had betrayed him, who had abandoned him, who was now facing her own mortality with the same fear he'd been living with for 2 years. She was alone, just as he had been alone, just as they were all alone when it really mattered. "I'll stay," he said. Marcus stayed with Rebecca until she fell asleep, her hand still holding his, her breathing gradually becoming more labored as the night wore on. When the nurses told him he really had to leave, he kissed her forehead gently and whispered, "I forgive you." Mrs. Chin was waiting for him in the hospital lobby, dozing in an uncomfortable plastic chair. She woke up when she heard his wheelchair and oxygen tank approaching. "How is she?" Mrs. Chun asked. "Dying," Marcus said simply. "Like me." "Are you okay?" Marcus thought about the question as Mrs. Chun helped him into her car. Was he okay? His ex-wife was dying alone in a hospital bed, burned and abandoned by the man she'd left him for. There was a kind of poetic justice in it, a sense that the universe had balanced the scales. But Marcus found that the justice felt hollow, unsatisfying. "I think so," he said finally. "I think I'm okay." Rebecca died 2 days later, while Marcus was undergoing what would turn out to be his final round of chemotherapy. The nurses told him gently, in the careful way that medical professionals deliver bad news. Marcus nodded and thanked them for letting him know, then closed his eyes and tried to feel something other than tired. He didn't attend Rebecca's funeral. He was too sick, and besides, he'd already said his goodbye. Marcus lasted another 3 weeks. His final days were spent in the hospice wing of the same hospital where he'd been receiving treatment for 2 years. Mrs. Chin was with him every day, along with Tom and Sarah and Mike and Ashley, the neighbors who had become his family. They took turns sitting by his bedside, reading to him, talking about their lives, making sure he wasn't alone. On his last day, Marcus was drifting in and out of consciousness, the morphine making everything soft and distant. He could hear voices around him. Mrs. Chin talking to a nurse, Tom making a phone call, Sarah crying quietly, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. In his dreams, Marcus was back Iraq, but not the Iraq of IEDs and firefights. He was in a peaceful version of Iraq, where the sun was warm and the air was clean, where his men were safe and whole, where letters from home brought good news instead of betrayal. In his dreams, he was strong again, healthy again. The soldier he'd been before cancer and chemotherapy and heartbreak had taken pieces of him away. He was surrounded by his unit, by the men who'd had his back, who trusted him to bring them home safely. "Sarge," one of them said, a young private whose name Marcus had never forgotten. "You ready to go home?" Marcus looked around at the faces of his soldiers, at the men he'd served with, fought with, bled with. They were smiling at him with the easy camaraderie of brothers in arms, waiting for his answer. "Yeah," Marcus said, "I'm ready." Marcus Williams died at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by people who loved him, people who had chosen to be his family when his biological family had failed him. His last words were, "Thank you for not leaving me alone." The funeral was small but meaningful. Mrs. Chin organized everything, working with the VA to ensure Marcus received full military honors. The American flag draped over his casket was folded with precision and presented to Mrs. Chun, who had been more of a family to Marcus in his final years than anyone else. Marcus's old unit sent representatives, 3 men who had served with him in Iraq, who had flown in from across the country to pay their respects to their former sergeant. They spoke about his courage, his leadership, his determination to bring everyone home safely. "Sergeant Williams saved my life in Fallujah," said one of them, a stocky man with graying hair and serious eyes. "But more than that, he taught us what it meant to take care of each other. He taught us that being a soldier wasn't about being the toughest or the strongest. It was about making sure your brothers made a home." The man paused, looking at the small crowd gathered in the cemetery. Marcus made a home from Iraq, but he fought another war after that. He fought it with dignity, with courage, and with the support of people who understood what love really looks like. That's the lesson he leaves us. That family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stand by you when standing by you is hard. As the ceremony concluded and the last notes of taps echoed across the cemetery, Mrs. Chun placed a single white rose on Marcus's casket. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting us love you." The neighbors dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave Marcus alone even in death. But eventually, it was just Mrs. Chin standing by the grave, holding a folded flag and thinking about the young man who had come into their lives broken and angry and scared, who had taught them all something about grace under pressure, about facing the end with dignity, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Marcus Williams had died as he had lived his final years, surrounded by love, supported by people who had chosen to see him as family, honored by those who understood the true cost of service and sacrifice. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because sometimes, when everything else falls apart, when your body betrays you and your spouse abandons you and your future disappears, the love of strangers who choose to become family is the only thing that matters. Sometimes it's everything.